This story is growing up in Charlestown, the projects. Charlestown is a neighborhood in Boston famous for the Bunkerhill Monument, the USS Constitution, the Boston Naval Shipyard, which are all stops along Boston's historic Freedom Trail. Charlestown, in addition to being known as the home of John Harvard of university fame, it also in the 1970s was known as the car theft, the bank robbery, and unsolved homicide capital of New England. The town, you may have seen recently, was featured in a film of the same name, and we'll get to some of those stories later, but today's story is about the Bunkerhill Housing Project. So the Bunkerhill Housing Project, that's where our family lived when I was born. It was built in 1940. It's the largest public housing development in New England, and my family moved there in 1964. So in 1964, my mom, my dad, and their 5 children at the time moved into a 4-bedroom apartment. And the family grew from 5 kids to 8 over the course of the next 5 years or so. So we had 10 people essentially living in a 4-bedroom apartment. Now that wasn't uncommon. There were a lot of families that had 6, 8, even 10 children back then. And so, it didn't seem to be an issue to have a couple of bunk beds in a bedroom. Nobody got their own bedroom or TV or anything like that. And my earliest memories of being there in the projects, kind of growing up, is playing on the cement animals in the courtyard. So they had some, they were basically precast concrete animals that were out in the courtyard area that you could climb on, right? So there was a zebra, I remember there was a turtle, and then there was another animal. I wasn't sure what it was, maybe a horse or a dog, and it was missing its ears. And instead of ears, it just had 2 pieces of rebar sticking out of its head. So anyway, it was an odd looking animal. Also, the way the buildings were set up, there were big courtyards in the middle, and the courtyard had clotheslines, multiple clotheslines that were in a fenced-in area, and each week families took turns hanging their laundry. So one family did their laundry on Mondays and Tuesdays, or a bunch of families did Mondays, a bunch did Tuesdays, a bunch did Wednesdays. Saturdays were typically a pretty busy day for hanging laundry out in the courtyard. And then, one thing that they had back then, which probably would not pass any of the environmental standards today, was an incinerator. So it was literally what you would think. There was a giant chimney, and I remember you would walk up a couple of steps, you would open up this steel door, and you would put your trash in, sort of like an old mailbox. And you put your trash in, you close the door, and the trash would fall down inside. And then there was a man who worked down in the basement, and he would set that to fire. And, it would just burn, and the smoke would go up and whatnot. One of the things that we did for fun, believe it or not, was to take bottles and put the bottle cap back on, glass bottles, and throw them into the incinerator. And what would happen is they eventually would heat up enough, the bottle would explode. I guess we didn't have video games back then. There was also, so the school that I went to for kindergarten was literally about 200 yards from the house. So I could walk out the door as a little 4-year-old kid, and typically I was with a brother, but walk over to school. And also on the corner there was a store called Joe's Meat Market, and Joe's Meat Market was really the corner grocery store, not a little convenience store. It was a good size store, and it was a meat market, but it also had all the other staples that you would need. And at Joe's Meat Market, our family had a tab. And the tab was basically, Mom would give us a note. We would go down, hey, we need this, this, and this, and this. They would wrap up the meat or get us the items or whatever and bag it all up and put it on the tab. Now, the concept of the tab is you don't have the money now, but you will have it in the future, and at that point you'll pay Joe. So for most people, that meant, waiting until Friday for payday, or a couple of weeks until they got their unemployment check, or whatever it might be, and then they would pay the tab. So essentially it was, you're getting things now and you're going to pay them when your ship comes in. And for our family, that was quite literal. So my dad was a merchant seaman, and he was away for, sometimes months at a time. And while he was away, my mother had no money. I remember the shipping company would send they called it an allotment check, but it was just a small part of his pay. But when he came home, my mother would take the money, she would pay off Joe's Meat Market and probably a clothing store and a shoe store and whatever else was in the neighborhood. But I don't think a lot of stores provide that kind of credit now, right? Everything is credit cards and interest rates, and there was no interest on your tab. It was just that you paid it. And I still remember some of the families from back then. I remember there was a woman named Mrs. Murphy who had an Irish accent that I could hardly understand what she was saying, but I smiled a lot and said, "Yes, ma'am." And she used to make the best Irish soda bread. And every once in a while, she would give my mother a call on the phone and say, "Could you send one of the boys over to get the Irish bread?" We also had, right across the way, were the Fishers, and one of them, Mary, used to babysit us a lot. And I remember they would, just sort of watch us out playing in the courtyard and whatnot. Everyone was kind of, grouped together in that area. That was sort of like the whole play area. And I recall that, later, years and years and years later, I was talking to my mother about the projects, and she said that she absolutely loved it there. So she had just moved from an apartment that was a 3rd-story walk-up in South Boston, and at the time she had 5 kids, all probably under the age of 10, a husband who was away sometimes for months at a time. And the landlady at that house would not let her keep her baby carriage in the front hall, so she had to drag it up 2 flights of stairs every time she came in, and then had to drag it back down 2 flights to go out. Before that, she was in another apartment, and she told me that the woman on the first floor was so cheap that she kept shutting the heat off. And so it would be the middle of the winter, she's got all these kids freezing in the house. So she absolutely loved it that the heat was included. It was on the first floor, and so that meant she didn't have to, carry a baby carriage up and down all these flights of stairs. So, although people look at public housing as a tough place and whatnot, and I certainly think it was back then, and it was in later years. It seemed to always be safe for locals, right? If you weren't causing trouble, you wouldn't get into any trouble there. And a few years ago, I was doing a presentation at UMass Boston about how Charlestown has changed throughout the years, and I went back to 50 Decatur Street to take a look. And I walked around, and the incinerator was gone. The clotheslines were all gone. They had actually, where that was, they had actually filled it all in with concrete and made it like a pseudo patio. Apparently they put down the cement animal with the bad ears and sent the other ones out to pasture. So it looked a lot different. And in the last couple of years or so, they started to knock down many of the old buildings of the Bunkerhill Housing Project, including 50 Decatur, to build mixed income housing. So they are planning on building retail, building low income. The rent in Boston right now is absolutely incredible. So I think you might have some low income people mixed in with what I assume is going to be high income folks in the same place. So, the town has changed drastically in 50 years. And, looking back at it and, what it was like growing up in the projects back then, I just don't think it's going to have the same camaraderie now as it did back then. But who knows? We shall see.